Hey guys! So today we're going to talk about the history of spoken word poetry. And spoken word poetry, though it seems like kind of a modern thing, is actually incredibly ancient. It's actually one of the most fundamental forms of poetry that we have. So if we take it all the way back, then our first communications as a society were based in our first communications as a society that were forms of art were poems. So we spoke in a sort of rhythmic manner. We created these artistic pieces, and that's how we gave life to things like the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. And there's also things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was a little bit before that. And that was an epic poem. All of these things were epic poems. You can see it in Northern Europe, whereas the Epic of Gilgamesh was down in India, and then the Iliad and the Odyssey were in Greece. There's the Poetic Edda in Scandinavian folklore, which tells the story of the Greek gods in poetry, and that was done to be read aloud. So in the most ancient forms of our world and our very simplest civilizations, we were utilizing spoken word poetry as the first line of artistic expression. And I think that's awesome. So the reason I care about spoken word poetry is because I am a spoken word poet. My name is Alora Young. I was the 2021 Youth Poet Laureate of the Southern United States and a young art scholar, and I'm an author. I wrote a book called Walking Gentry Home that chronicles 270 years of my family history in a small town in West Tennessee entirely in verse. And that book has an audiobook, and I think the audiobook is by far the best way to perceive and experience what I've written, because I'm a spoken word poet, so my words flow the best from my voice. And I think that the audiobook is a really exceptionally done piece of media. And I hope you will read it and I hope you will like it. But I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the history of spoken word poetry so that you can have a more background about why it is we do what we do and how it all came into being. Another very ancient tradition of spoken word poetry is the African griots. Griots are very popular in the Wolof society in Africa, the Wolof tribe. And African griots have a long history of being storytellers and poets and often sometimes musicians. And they told these stories through ancient poetry, and they were pinnacles. They were like fundamental features of African society during this time period, especially Wolof society. Like, African griots were their own class in Wolof society. They were a separate class from other distinctions like healers or wives or other different distinctions of people. Griots, this means like a storyteller, were their own class of people. Oral storytelling is also really fundamental to a lot of cultures in like Native American and Latin American cultures. So oral storytelling is a fundamental tradition that has been explained and explored all over the world. From Native Americans to Africans to Scandinavians. All over the world, people were doing oral storytelling and spoken word poetry. And I think it's the fundamental way that humans express themselves through art. And I think it's not only extremely fascinating, but beautiful and a fundamentally human thing. Shakespeare is another example of the utilization of poetry and the spoken word in the Shakespeare was an example of the use of the spoken word in his era of history in the 1500s, I believe.
I don't know this.
I think it was the 1500s. I could be wrong. There's going to be a little fact check right here if it wasn't the 1500s. But he wrote an iambic pentameter, which is a certain meter of poetry that expresses, it's supposed to sync to the human heartbeat, da-da, 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 da-da. And so his form of poetry was not only, and he used this to express strong emotions in his plays. And then he also wrote a lot of sonnets, which is a very popular form of poetry. But his poems were meant to be performed. They were meant to be read aloud because not everybody could read back then. And because so few people could read, and because we lived in an audio-visual society and not a text-based society, we leaned towards spoken word poetry as a tool for expressing our human condition through art. And so Shakespeare wrote these poems and these plays, and through that he became one of the most famous artists of all time. And then as we get further into history, we get into the beat poets like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac of the 1960s and the 1950s and 60s, and the civil rights movement. And the beat poets were famous for their use of poetry as like a rhythmic tool, and they performed poetry in such a way that it was very it was a unique style of poetry that had not really been seen before the beat poets' time. And it evolved into what we now know as modern day spoken word poetry. And the civil rights movement used a lot of spoken word as activism during the civil rights movement for progressing our society, and progressing the world for Black Americans. And spoken word poetry was a really fundamental part of that movement too. Protest songs and protest poems and all of these things were really integral to the civil rights movement, and it became sort of an iconic part of what we now know as a major movement in American history. And then in the 1970s and 80s, open mics started to emerge. Things like the New York and Poets Cafe, which is now one of the most famous spoken word open mics of all time. And it was established in New York as a hub for spoken word artists, and it revolutionized how we do open mics. And I think it's such a beautiful demonstration of the art of spoken word. And if you ever get the opportunity to go see a performance at the New York and Poets Cafe, absolutely do. And then there's the intersection of spoken word and hip hop. Spoken word was influenced very heavily by hip hop and its rhythm and rhyme, and because all hip hop, specifically rap, is rhythm and poetry. So it's really just poetry with a beat. And I think that's really fascinating. And it emphasized rhythmic and lyrical expression and created a new layer to spoken word poetry that sort of had this hip hop influence that created this unique sort of genuinely American sound that can't really be found. Well, it can be found other places now, but it was innovated here and it became something beautiful here. The first poetry slam was founded by Mark Smith in Chicago in 1986. That's the first named poetry slam. But there have been poetry slams before that were not really called poetry slams, or and there's a lot of things that evolved into this poetry slam. And I think it's really awesome how poetry slams evolved and became a unique piece of American history. Then there's the National Poetry Slam, and there's things like Louder Than a Bomb in Chicago, which are poetry slams that are huge, and they're for teenagers usually. And they have thousands and thousands of competitors, and all of those people are coming together to do spoken word poetry. I think Louder Than a Bomb had a name change. I think they call it something different now, but when I knew it, it was called Louder Than a Bomb. Slam poetry is a style of poetry that is performed on stage out loud, and you're not supposed to use props or sound effects, so you're supposed to just use your own voice and your own body to make poetry and to make movement and to make art. And so a slam poem is different than a regular poem in that it is made to be performed. So it has a lyrical and sonic quality that other poems distinctly lacked. Whereas you might write a poem on the page to look nice on the page, you would write a slam poem to sound nice to the ears and to be good when performed and to be expressive and to be vivid to the human eye. And that's really the distinct difference between slam poetry and traditional poetry. The Epic of Gilgamesh is from ancient Mesopotamia, and it is one of the earliest performances of literature. It's the earliest known piece of literature, and it was originally transmitted orally until somebody wrote it down. But it's a fundamental part of human culture, and I think that the fact that the Epic of Gilgamesh was an epic poem is a really fascinating thing, and it really goes to show just how integral poetry is in our human condition. Indian Vedas is what I was thinking of before. From 1500 BCE to 500 BCE, ancient Sanskrit texts that were originally orally recited before being written down, the Indian Vedas. Medieval troubadours were from the 11th century to the 13th century, and they were poets and musicians who performed lyrical poetry in European courts. And these troubadours, there were a lot of really well-known ones at the time, and they were jesters and performers, and they were famous poets of the time. And this was way before Shakespeare. So they were doing a kind of poetry in Old English, and it sort of evolved into what we now know as Shakespeare's Older English, which is actually Middle English, which evolved into our modern day poetic enterprise. And then there's Beowulf, which is an epic poem from the Anglo-Saxon England, and it was originally an oral poem that was transmitted and written down into a poem on the page for the literary text-based era that existed from approximately the 1500s to really until the evolution of YouTube and TikTok. We still live in a very text-based society. We still read and write a lot, but before the 1500s, most people went to church and they were given a sermon. They didn't read the Bible. People heard plays, they watched plays, they saw all these things and all these poems performed to them. They didn't read them. And then there was an era where people became literate and they started reading poems and reading all of these things. And then as we get into the modern day, we have gone back to watching things and taking in information through a non-literary audio-visual lens. And then there's the Divine Comedy by Dante, which is a very famous epic poem with a strong oral storytelling elements. And I feel like everybody's heard of the Divine Comedy. Dante talks about a journey through the 9 circles of hell. There's like a lake of boiling blood, and it's crazy. But that originally had a lot of oral storytelling elements as well. And then there was the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, which is a cultural movement that saw the rise of African-American poets like Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes is one of my favorite poets. And his work has really been an inspiration to me. And I think the Harlem Renaissance is such an integral time in human history, in American history, for poets. And it really changed the landscape of poetry as we know it. And it created a whole new giant explosion of art and culture and poetry for us to explore and evolve from. And then there's the Beat Generation from the 1940s to the 1960s, Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, who performed their poetry aloud, emphasizing spontaneity and rebellion. And then there's a landmark poem in the Beat Poet movement called Ginsberg's Howl, 1955, which was first performed at the 6th Gallery reading in San Francisco, and it's a really famous poem, and I highly recommend you check it out. Deaf Poetry Jam was a TV show on HBO that brought spoken word to a wider audience, and I think it's a great show. You should check it out. And then Youth Speaks is an organization that promotes spoken word through events like Brave New Voices, which is a major movement in youth spoken word poetry. And every year, teams compete in Brave New Voices to be a new representative of the United States at national poetry competitions. And then there are things like the Youth Poet Laureate program, of which I was a participant, where the youth of America all over the country compete to be the National Youth Poet Laureate. And that is like a person who represents like the spirit of American youth poets. And she does community service. Not she, it can be a guy, but they do community service, and they represent our poets as a community. And I think it's a really awesome program, run by, my organization was called Southern Word. I think the one in New York is called Urban Word. Some notable poets of the spoken word generation and the spoken word movement are Amiri Baca, Sonia Sanchez, Jill Scott Heron, Patricia Smith, and Sarah Kay. Those are just some poets for you to check out if you were looking to read more poetry. And then YouTube and social media have been a huge boon for spoken word poets everywhere, because now our spoken word poems and spoken word poets can reach the masses of a society. And spoken word poems are going viral. They're becoming widely beloved. Button poetry is now a thing that is world renowned, and our poems are all over and people are loving them. And I think that spoken word has evolved from the most ancient of ancient human traditions into one of the most cutting edge modern traditions. And I think spoken word is a beautiful piece of our art. I think it's a beautiful piece of our history, and I hope you will take the time to check it out. Thank you. Bye. Who's at the door? Hello, brother.
Hey.
We're making a YouTube video.
Are y'all live right now?
Yeah.
My bad.
We're not live, we're just recording.